Good evening, welcome to my laboratory. In the previous video I showed this kind of a pulse train that was coming from the Perpendupetulum's coil triggering the pendulum oscillations, and we were using the normal edge trigger to trigger the scope on that signal, and that's the normal way that we are used to triggering oscilloscopes on most signals, is by using edge trigger. So if I change the horizontal time-based setting to expand that pulse, you can see that the scope is actually triggering on the first falling edge at this position right here, where the two little trigger symbols cross right there. And if I expand more in the horizontal direction, you can see that we are indeed triggering on that first sub-pulse, the falling edge of it right there. And to view other pulses, I would have to take the horizontal position control and move the whole trace until other pulses appear on the screen, and that can be kind of a pain. I can't even find another one right now at this time-based setting. One convenient thing about the Rigol scopes is that to bring the horizontal position reference back to the center of the screen, all you need to do is push on the horizontal position control button like that, and that centers it. And the same is true with things like the channel baseline reference. If I just push on the channel vertical scale button, the channel vertical position button, that automatically snaps that back to center. But that's not where I wanted it. I wanted it up where it was, right about there. Okay, so I digress. So let's go back to where we were looking at this pulse train here. And let's say that I didn't want to look at the very first pulse in there, but I want to look at some pulse down here in the middle range. How do I do that? Well, I use the so-called Runt Trigger mode. So in the trigger type menu here, I scroll on down to the Runt Trigger, not window, but Runt right there, and select that. And now you can see that what we've got is some sub-menus, but the most important thing is that we have these two trigger markers here. So when we are in this particular window mode here, which means between the two triggers, the scope will actually trigger on the first pulse that whose bottom edge falls in between those two triggers. So that's, you can sort of see what it's doing already. There's the horizontal position and there's the vertical position of those two little triggers, and that's where it's winding up. So if I expand the horizontal scale now, we zoom in on that particular single pulse out of that whole pulse train, because it's the first one whose peak or bottom edge falls right in between those triggers. And I can use the trigger horizontal position control to move those guys and get different pulses out of that pulse train. Towards the end, they become really small. Excuse me. And of course, I can by selecting a different window mode, I can move those apart or just use one or the other of them and either go above or below or between those two triggers to select the particular size pulse that I'm looking for. So here you can see that our trigger is still in the center of the screen, but instead of triggering on some pulse way down here or the very first pulse, we're triggering on the pulse that falls right in between that trigger level. So if I move that down, we can select an earlier pulse and then zoom in on that earlier pulse in the train. So that's the use of the Runt Trigger mode on these oscilloscopes, which can be very useful when you have a train of pulses that vary and you don't want to look at the very first one, but you want to look at some other pulse, maybe of a lower amplitude that's within that pulse train. These all look the same, but they don't necessarily need to. Okay, that's it. Thanks for watching.